Hello, we did an observational study at your elementary school where we collected data regarding students on task behavior amongst 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and we just wanted to present you with these details. So basically, how we did this is, first of all, we had to develop the idea, like, how should we go about collecting this data, how should we look at the data, how should we organize it, stuff like that. So we planned the collection, so we decided to look at whether they were sitting in their chair or not, whether they were actually doing their classwork, and whether they were making eye contact with the teacher during assignments or during just class instruction. And so for our next one, we had to organize spreadsheets so that we could get reasonable data and so that it could be compared to all the other data that we collected. And then also we consulted a person at our school, Mr. Dixon, who is a master's in behavioral science, and he sort of helped us with how we should be able to collect this data and just organize it and what we should be looking for in order to like consider it certain pieces of data. And also we had to schedule the time to come to your school and actually get the data, and just
So the main question we asked is what factors influence student engagement. So some other questions we asked were, does grade affect engagement? Does gender affect engagement? Is there a correlation between different types of engagement? And does on-task behavior indicate higher participation? And the last one was, are males more likely to demonstrate hyperactive behavior, such as being out of their chair?
Okay, so our research methods for when we're collecting our data were we entered a classroom and then selected 5 students randomly. And then we tried to get a mix of males and females so that our data would be equal when we were looking at gender. So every 5 minutes of being in the class, we would record 3 different things. And the first was whether the student was sitting in their chair. The second was whether the student was looking at the teacher. And the third was if the student was demonstrating on-task behavior. And we defined on-task behavior by working on the assigned task, asking questions to the teacher, not talking to their neighbors, and just, generally not being distracted. And then we analyze our data into the upcoming slides.
So the first thing that we analyzed was girls versus boys. So some of the conclusions that we got from this data, we created this is a box plot of female engagement. Here you can see that 75% of the females were 75 to 100% engaged, and that's a little different than the males. So here you can see that the max wasn't even close to being at 1, and 75% of the data of the males, they were not engaged. They were engaged 55 to 65% of the time.
Okay, and then just a quick explanation for the box plots. So this line that extends up and down, and then this line that crosses, they all interact. So this lower line is 25% of the data. This middle section is 50%, and then this is another 25. So another way that you could look at this is you could say, since the small line is underneath, this is 25% of the data. So 75% of the data was above 75% engagement. And then here, the lower 75% of the data was below 75 engagement. So what you can see by looking at these two is the female engagement was generally higher than the male engagement. Okay, so this is the engagement, but broken up by grade. And so since it's in that same box plot form, you can see the spread with the small lines and the big lines. And so what this is showing is for the 4th grade, about 75% of the students were just above 75% engagement, and then the lower 25 dropped all the way down to about maybe 45% engagement. The 5th grade was less of a spread, and so 100% of their engagement was between about 60 and 70% engagement. And then the 6th grade had the biggest spread, and that was also likely due to the fact that less 6th graders were observed, but their spread went from all the way to 100% engagement to 0% engagement, and 75% of the time the engagement was above 50%.
Okay, here's the engagement amongst the 4th graders that we observed. So as you can see, we have the percentage of students who are sitting in their chair, as well as the percentage of on task and eye contact with the teacher. And also this 4th column to the right is the average of all 3 of the previous data points, just for a better visual. As you can see, the on task and eye contact slots are very similar, so those might have a correlation between one another. Maybe looking at the teacher is a sign of engagement, more likely than sitting in a chair, as you can see, because there's just a lot less, the data is more spread out. As you can see on these two, 75% of the students were above this mark, but only about, there's a spread of like 25 right here. That was really strange, but generally maybe the eye contact has more of a correlation with on-task behavior than sitting in a chair would. For example, I saw some students walking around rather than sitting in a chair, but they were still doing their work.
Alright, so this is the 5th grade. Lucas and I both observed this class, and well, the 5th grade had 2 classes. They would change, and we saw a correlation between the 2 different teachers, both female, but one was reading and one was science. During the reading portion, a lot of the students she wanted these students to be actively engaged in sitting in their seat and raising their hand, paying attention to what she was saying about J. Biztown, whereas the science teacher had them more active throughout the whole classroom, having them stand up if they couldn't sit in their seat, moving around talking to a partner that wasn't next to them, talking about science related items, and if they were engaged, they were better behaved students. So as you can see, a lot of the 5th grade is below the 75th percentile, and that kind of just correlates back to the science class, as where when the teacher would have them discuss science matters, they wouldn't discuss science matters and would play around with their friend or stand up in their seat and dance instead of paying attention to the teacher and being on task.
The student's not here, so we're gonna go to the next slide.
So one of the things Lucas and I, what we observed was, where we looked into further, was the sitting in the chair. So here you can see that the max of the females was 100%. So I'll get to this later, but there's most of the students are sitting in their chair, female students. So there's a very high number of students in their chair, where as the males, there was not at any time 100% of the males in their chairs. The max doesn't even reach up to 100%. So there wasn't even one student.
Yeah, so both of these spreads are pretty similar for the most part, just because they're the 75th, 75% of the data is above the 75th percentile. But yeah, there's kind of like a slight favoring towards the females, and for the most part, they spend more of their time sitting in their chairs than the males do.
Alright, Lucas, come talk about the conclusion. I'll do this.
Is that the
Cut it out
conclusion?
in post, it's alright.
Okay, well, so basically what we concluded from our data was that among the 3 subcategories of engagement that we're studying, which were sitting in the chair, being on task, and looking at the teacher, the most important subcategory, the 2 most important were looking at the teacher and demonstrating on task behavior. And we concluded that sitting in the chair was not exactly indicative of being engaged in the task, and kids were able to be out of their chairs and still demonstrate engagement though some of the kids that we observed did take advantage of the privilege, the overwhelming majority demonstrated that they were able to do so and stay on task.
Just the errors is next.
I guess a couple errors that we could have encountered while we were collecting our data was that our presence in the classroom could have affected the way the students were behaving.
Some students didn't have the full capacity to focus throughout the whole class time, especially because we were observing 5 students in each classroom, and a lot of the times the students were hard to manage because they'd move around, or we just didn't have the time to write down all our data at the same time.
Yeah, it was difficult trying to observe 5 students at the same time because it was just hard to capture everything that was going on at the same time because the classroom could be a little chaotic. And then I think also another thing we could have done was maybe get a larger sample that was selected in a way that was more random than just by picking random students out of the group. Maybe we could have drawn out of a hat or something, just something that would have been more random.
Going off what Lucas said, like oftentimes I would see that every 5 minutes, like I would start observing somebody, and then while in time, like I would get to my 3rd student, they would kind of already have shifted. So like that's one possible error. Yeah. Any more?
There's, in my class in particular, a couple of the students I were observing actually left the class and didn't return halfway through the block that I was observing, and so that skewed my data. I didn't have as many points to use in like building the graphs.
So we just want to say thank you for letting us come and learn and also observe your students. It was definitely a good learning experience for us. So thank you.
Thank you.